Good evening. Welcome to our panel talk celebrating the exhibition Return to Entry, currently on display in the Ringgold Gallery. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Erica Quam. I'm the Visitor Services and Program Coordinator for Purdue Galleries. And before we get started, I have a litany of thank yous. First and foremost, thanks to my colleagues Michael Hathaway and Christina Sikra, and our former director Liz Erlewine for all your hard work on this show. Thanks to Tracy Grimm and Purdue Archives and Special Collections for your partnership to make everything happen. Thanks to Angelica Duran and her English 413 class for your research, dedication, and enthusiasm. Thanks to the Mars Student Club for your help and support bringing Amy Ross to campus, and thanks for Amy to agreeing to join this panel. And finally, thanks to Jen Shire, Francis Gallardo, and Michael Oatman for your incredible talent and dedication to this exhibition. The intention of the Return to Entry exhibition was to celebrate Purdue's sesquicentennial and the 50th anniversary of the lunar landing by exploring and finding inspiration in Purdue's Baron Hilton flight archives, and specifically the Neil A. Armstrong papers. Return to Entry is a collaboration of art, science, and discovery, and invites the viewer to find inspiration in the three artists' different reflections on the archives. The exhibition was made possible with funds from the Florence H. Lonsford Committee. In addition, I am pleased to announce that the beta version of the Purdue Spacewalks map is now out. This map was created by Angelica Duran and her English 413 class, and includes 3 different routes exploring campus that highlight Purdue's ties to space exploration. So please pick one up in the gallery when you visit after the panel talk. Our panel host for this evening is Jana Arndt, who recently completed her MFA in electronic and time-based art. Jana will be giving a talk at the International Symposium on Electronic Art this summer in Gwangju, Korea. And here is Jana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday evening. And I also wanted to thank Erica for that wonderful introduction, and as well to thank the Purdue Galleries for allowing me to host this panel. When I first come to the idea of hosting this panel, I selfishly thought of my own research as an MFA student. I'm really interested in the intersections between emerging technologies and how they can be used as a critical art form. So as soon as I found out who was on the panel, I was super interested in all of your work and how you've managed to marry these two fields together. So many of you might have noticed that there has been a recent emphasis in STEM in education. I'm sure that's not news to anyone. And there is a significant lack of an A in STEM, right? So that's science, technology, engineering, and math. So I really wanted this panel discussion to be a way to look back at the ways art and science have been linked in the history of humanity, but also a way to look at different ways that artists are using scientific data in their work today. So without further ado, I'll introduce all of our panelists. Amy Ross is an advanced spacesuit designer at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston and a graduate of Purdue University. So welcome back to Purdue.
Thank you.
Amy Ross has been with NASA for over 20 years, specializing in pressure garments. She has served as the spacesuit team lead, spacesuit hardware technology development lead, CXP spacesuit system PGS manager, I don't know what that means, but it sounds very important, and space launch initiative crew escape suit engineering lead, with most of her experience in advanced planetary spacesuit development and testing. So the next panelist is Jen Shire. She is an artist and collaborative printer invested in lithography and the history of print. She is currently a visiting assistant professor at Purdue University teaching printmaking and serving as the foundation's drawing coordinator. Her work addresses ideas surrounding historical practices of healing and medicine and plants. So thank you, Jennifer. Francis Gallardo is another artist visiting from New York. She has exhibited extensively both nationally and internationally. Her work employs the use of archived weather data as the basis for multimedia works, collages, and large-scale installations that explore the representation of landscape and meteorology. Michael Oatman is our last panelist. He is an associate professor at the College of Architecture at Rensselaer in Troy, New York, where he produces multimedia artworks that include painting, video, and artifacts from material culture to create works that speak about the paradigm shifts in the sciences, history, human relations, and technology. So,
I'd say that's accurate.
Is that accurate? Okay. Hopefully I haven't offended anyone already. So I just wanted to give a breakdown of how this panel will run. I just want this to be a conversation, so if I pose any questions, feel free to respond, even if it wasn't directed towards you. There will be time for questions at the end, so be thinking of them in your minds as we carry on this discussion. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. First, I would like each panelist to kind of discuss their work. So we'll start with Amy Ross.
Well, I feel like the slacker because I don't create art. But I view engineering and art just as two different outlets for creative energy. And so I find art is an excellent tool for my job. Unfortunately, my art skills kind of peaked in 4th grade. So I need help when I need to do art. But you can see the power of artistic representations of an organization, right? There's not a word involved in that blue symbol that we know immediately that's the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. You know that's got to do with space and flying people to the moon and the space shuttle and going, everything associated with NASA. And it's immediately recognizable, a lot more evocative than something like typed out National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Right? It just doesn't have the same emotional impact or amount of information exchanged as that symbol does. And so recognizing that, each group at NASA, each organization, each project tends to make their own so that's their group identity. And so that's my current group identity up there. And that's our exploration suit initiative. So you can see what it shows is Earth is the blue there, then Moon is gray, real close to the Earth, and then you can see Mars out there, and then beyond that even with the star represented. Of course, you see the shape of the helmet with the human head, and then because I have a colleague that works on the backpack of the life support system of the suit system, they wanted to make sure that they had their big box represented as well. And so that's why you see the black outline of the spacesuit system with the portable life support system. And of course, then we've got the space station over there too, because that's the first place we're going to fly. So you can see our intent and our product all in that one image. Okay? Now, I use art, like I said, and one of the things that you need to do is communicate to your colleagues and your managers about what your idea is. And one of the things that you learn early on is that the more pictures in a presentation to managers, the better off you are. So when you're trying to express an idea, it's better to have an image that very clearly expresses that idea for you. And so in this image up here, what this is two different ideas for building the cover layer for the shoulder and arm sections. And in this one here, it's segmented, so there's a different cover layer for the upper torso, for the shoulder, then the lower arm, and then the glove. Whereas in this image over here, that's all basically one long section with the disconnect that you can use to resize as that darker black image. So obviously when you're talking to a manager, you can point those things out and they get a much better idea about what you're trying to describe to them. So that's how we use those kinds of pieces of art. So it was funny because I came in the other day and two of my engineers were like over the table like with pencils coloring. I was like, what are you doing? And then they told me what they're doing. I was like, oh yeah, that's a really great idea. But I mean, it looked like they were in grade school going at it with their pencils. It was funny. Okay, let's go to the next one. And then one of the things that I don't get to do very often is I don't get to design the spacesuit for aesthetics. This is an image of several of my prototype spacesuits that we've had over since Mark III was developed in 1989. And then the Z2 most recently in 2015. So in general, what you normally know as a spacesuit is solely a function over form kind of product. But there were a couple instances where we got to play with the aesthetic a little bit, and boy, did that make a difference. So when we did the Z1 spacesuit, my vendor knew they had to deliver a cover layer on the suit, and they said, hey, we're thinking about doing a little bit of a design with it, and what color are you thinking? And I said pink, and my team doesn't like that. So another team member said, how about green? And so they picked that color, and once they got that color, they were inspired, right? So who does that look like?
Buzz Lightyear.
Buzz Lightyear. See, just that color with that patterning evokes that image like now. And that is, I think, one of the reasons that spacesuit was picked as one of Time's Inventions of the Year. I was like, cool. That's one way to communicate out, right? You get that attention, you get that recognition, and so it worked very well for us. And on that thought, with the Z2 spacesuit, one of the things we did include in that contract with the vendor that won that contract to build that suit was that we did want an aesthetic cover layer. This isn't going to go to space. It doesn't have to do all the functions it needed to do. The cover layer has a less important job at this stage. And so we could play with it and think about how we wanted it to look. And so we worked with a school in Philadelphia and their School of Design, and they did a process that I thought was very interesting in that they said, well, what kind of feelings do you want people to have looking at this? What do you want to evoke from people when they look at this? And so we got to, we kind of looked at them like, nobody asks us that question ever. So we had to think about it a little bit. But we got to work through this creative process with them. And so we kind of came up with, biomimicry, thinking about inspiration from nature. Okay, because that's one of the things we do try to do is try to think about how nature solves some of these tough problems and can we use that in some way. Superheroes, spacemen are superheroes, right? Space women. And so, what kind of aesthetic could you get from that? And then we had a couple other ideas, and that's when they came up with their idea boards with different textures and different colors and different kinds of shapes. And from that, then as we had conversation and picked and chose, then they came up with this selection among a couple others, and then we did a public engagement activity where folks got to vote on which one actually got made. And that really generated hundreds of thousands of people getting engaged and having their say in how we built our spacesuit, which we thought was wonderful. And so, because if we don't have public support, we don't get to do our job, and we like doing our job, so we'd like to keep doing that. So that's another way that art has really been very productive in us doing our job within our ability to do that. So I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about here today because I'm not an artist, but art is so very important in how we communicate what we do and how people get engaged with what we do.
Thank you. So I do have one question for you before we move on that I was just interested in. In our conversation earlier, you had talked about you have this green hat, black hat system that you use in your creative process. And so I was just wondering if you had more to add to your creative process.
Yeah. So I haven't done a sociological study to see if it's more engineers or just people. But one of the things that one of my colleagues and mentors did for me is that he presented creativity and how to inspire creativity and use your creativity and build creativity in a group. So one of the things you do is brainstorming. You've all heard about brainstorming activities. Well, then when you start looking at brainstorming activities and start trying to talk about them, one of the first kinds of things that come out from people are why it's bad, right? That's bad. Well, that's your black hat. You don't get to put on your black hat till after you've done a couple other things. So first you put on your yellow hat, okay? Well, your white hat. White hat's the good guy, right? White hat. So that's where you say all the good things about that concept first, okay? And then you can work through the other hats and get to your black hat and say the bad things. But then you've collected a more honest and complete list of the pluses and minuses of each concept before you move on to the next stage of down selection. So that's the hats.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a lot of similarities between that and like other creative processes.
Right.
Thank you. All right, so we'll move on to Jen's work, if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit of some of the work that you have in the gallery.
Sure. My pieces in the gallery there's 4 frame pieces along kind of the back wall. And they all unite or relate to one another. Kind of my thought was creating a space or maybe a room where these pieces existed in the same space. So going into the collections, I had thought about maybe doing something related to medicine, but as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about the fervor and excitement of the space program and how many careers that's impacted, and that excitement of childhood and thinking about what you can be or can be anyone. And so the pieces that I made kind of embed that idea of the fervor that it exists everywhere within this space. It's on the wallpaper and it's in the ornamentation of the clock here in this image. And then I started thinking about what those images might look like. And the first image I had thought about was this clock. And so I've integrated different imagery in the clock. There's the orbit around the Earth from the Gemini missions, as well as the navigational chart that's in the middle of the clock. And then if you look at all of the ornamentation, you can see that there's the entrance into space and the return from space that's in the ornamentation around the clock. Another piece that's not pictured here in the gallery is a silk screen of a wall with shadows of a mobile in it. So there's a lower point of view or lower perspective in that image. So it's kind of suggesting who might be in that space with these 4 images. And then the next slide. This image is, perhaps a moonscape or something suggestive of that. And there's some silver ink that's in quite a few of the pieces that reveals a little bit more information or suggests more information in each piece. And so the silver ink here is a navigational orbit chart. So thinking about if you're in this space, like getting back and returning from this space. And then the final image. This piece is, again, kind of thinking about the history of observation of space and then traveling to the moon and returning. And then something that I found really interesting as I was doing research is that there is a near side of the moon and a far side of the moon. And the far side of the moon wasn't photographed until the early 1950s. And so just thinking about that observation and something that we can see so easily with our own eyes, and what we're aware of and how the impact of space travel has impacted that as well. So, and then there's some silver in this image that suggests light in the evening that's coming through in the images. So
I'm also just curious. So while you were observing all of these objects in this amazing archive, did you draw any connections between your own medium? I know you know a lot about the history of printing as a medium. So did you draw connections between that and the objects in the archive?
I think that's why I was so attracted to the amount of material that was for the masses, basically. So the pieces that I chose for the exhibition were things that were popular of appeal. So one of them was a log of the Apollo 11 book that had just some humorous notes in it that I thought were really great about how Neil Armstrong had slept in a hammock on the moon. Another one was the $5 a day on the moon. So I was looking at what is accessible and easy, and was available to people, and what was the interest, or how did we make the experience of space travel accessible to the public. And so a lot of that is related to the printmaking industry and printmaking traditions of making mass amounts of material. So I'm interested in ephemera and the ephemera that's been collected over time as well. And so that was a connection I think I made between the choices of the work that I made for this exhibition and the medium I work in. So.
Thanks. All right. Next is Frances's work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to kind of dovetail into this accessibility word that you just used. What you're seeing here is a paper cutout of a series of portraits I was doing on aerial imagery of hurricanes. And something was... So there was this situation in which, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and something that I think has really shaped my work and also inspired me has been that back and forth, and also the idea of being away from home. And this accessibility of images, of the place where you are from, has been a source of inspiration for almost 10 years. So something that drew me into hurricanes was just thinking about, how my family is doing, this emotional connection to all this phenomena. And so all of a sudden, I'm watching the news in my computer, just like the weather person. And I was like, there's something odd about the way that hurricanes are being represented, as this like destructive, of course it is, right? And I thought that was a different kind of experience that I was having, of these memories of, growing up around a sense of community, hurricanes being this like, almost like in the Arawak Taino culture of the, of the Caribbean, this god of the storm that would, fertilize the land, that would clean the air, that would take down, trees that were, taking the nutrients from healthy trees. And I was like, there's some sort of like difference between this personal experience and the way that all these like hurricane representation is being filtered through the news. So I became interested in creating these series of portraits where I would kind of recover, right, this beauty and this other force and this fragility of the hurricane. So this is just one example of many. The next image is also inspired by hurricanes in a sense of sort of like togetherness. All those, I don't know if you can see some of the nodes, you probably can see like 3 connecting points. So there's something really interesting to me too about like all this data that we can gather, right? All those previous portraits of hurricanes were based on satellite imagery. And so I became really interested in looking at like archival images from the 80s, 90s, and how those qualities of the portraits of hurricanes have evolved or changed according to the technology that you have. And so I would take that infrared image and replace it with all those lace patterns and organic patterns, sort of like connecting to the transparency of the air, So I really wanted to kind of represent this in a different way. And in this piece titled The Unnamed, I got into NOAA's Hurricane Track Archive. And they have this fascinating interactive interface where you click on any point and it will tell you it would show you all of the lines of the hurricanes. But it was massive, right? A massive amount of lines all over, right? From the 1800s on. And so I chose the ones that had crossed, that had no name. And I sort of wanted to give them a place in history. And it was something really interesting too about thinking about naming nature, like why, So I decided to represent these maroonish, right, kind of rogue hurricanes. I don't know if you can appreciate it very well, but I also wanted to make a distinction using color and also the embroidery stitch. Talking a little bit about the different personalities of the hurricanes. Like all of them have different like velocities. They, put a lot of rain. Like they just have different characteristics and personalities that obviously impact daily life and the effects, that they bring to any geographical area. So that was also like kind of a more poetic and personal way of creating these pieces. And the next one is titled Murmurations. It's like an installation of 1,025 individual pieces of drawings on the wall. And again, like, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the subject matter that I like to work with, yes, it is based on scientific data, but it's also around things that are difficult to cope with. Like hurricanes are disastrous, like mosquitoes are, disease. But something that I also love about art is that the way that you can use, drawing and line and seductive shapes to bring people to talk about these and have these conversations. So I think I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. So I also had a question for you. So this piece relates quite a bit to the piece that's already in the gallery. So can you talk about like the differences between working with the data that you were working with this piece and the data that you had in the archive?
Oh, yes. Wow. Well, yes. I think there's a connection definitely between the way that I approached the material and how I installed it. I'm absolutely fascinated by drawing. I love it. And as you've seen, I'm interested in meteorological data and like weather patterns and all this stuff. But when I went to the archive, I was so curious to see like, how does weather look like out there? How do you predict that? Today, planes, they have all these like weather aviation guides and all this, but how do you even see it? How is it numbers? Like And so when I went into the archive, I found like this massive amount of information that to me felt as an artist and an untrained eye, like fragmented. And so I was fascinated by this, the marks, the folding of paper, just the choreographies of how people were disseminating all this information, the schematic data, charts, diagrams, and they had this amazing beauty. You know, I thought that it also just like captured, I don't know, an aesthetic of the time. And I wanted to bring that to the fore, right? Like that quality of the line, the typography, all of that. And so I took all these fragments, little details of all those charts that I was looking into. I digitized them and then created this kind of whirlpool of information and data that almost feels like you're looking at from above. Yes, so there's that. And yeah.
Thank you.
I think that makes
Yeah.
it.
Okay, so the next is Michael Oman.
Well, hi, everybody. First of all, I want to say how pleased I am to be in this show, to be, exhibiting with Jen and Francis, and it's been a real treat to meet Amy today. I've been looking forward to that, and I also wanted to thank Tracy Grimm, the head of the archive, for Armstrong's papers and for Michael Hathaway's help in putting this show together. This is kind of a dream gig for an artist, right? Where you're basically asked to do something, right? It's not very framed out. And it's scary territory, I think, for a student, but it's the invitation that you really want at a certain point in your career. My mom purchased the World Book Encyclopedia for us in 1971. And, it would arrive every so often, a couple of volumes. And I took very seriously that suggestion that this was a thing to dive into. It was the internet before the internet. And so sort of that vastness became, my counterpart to my other daily experience growing up in Vermont, which was being outside in nature. And so, that notion of learning from experience and, sometimes falling out of trees, but then also spending the evenings with the flashlight under the blanket reading was a really great foundation for being an artist. So much so that I think about a decade ago, I began to question the term artist because I was using lots of other methods to make work. Sometimes I would pretend to be a researcher and interview people, or act more like a private investigator, or I'd be working in a territory that seemed more like engineering in dialogue with a bunch of other people. So even though that trope of that we're all familiar with, the artist, maybe it's a Renaissance idea of working kind of alone in the studio, there's also this idea of the atelier. Rubens had a team of people. There was the apple guy and the person who painted drapery. And so for me, that experience of working solo in the studio, being very much inside your head, has a beautiful counterpart in the idea of teamwork. And so the evidence of that is very large in the archive here at Purdue, right? And about how NASA operated. And really, Armstrong's insistence on thanking the team, right, was, I think, a very beautiful sort of notion. This is a collaboration with a friend of mine, Brian Kane, with whom I've worked off and on for 25 years. We met at Rhode Island School of Design. And, I got one of those invitations in 2014, which was, there's this festival in in Toronto called Nuit Blanche, the White Night. And it's a 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. art festival, 12 hours only. And would I design something for that, a 12-hour artwork? I have to tell you, I went through 6 distinctly different proposals, including the world's largest jigsaw puzzle, which would have been assembled in Toronto Blue Jays Stadium. So you can imagine maybe 1,000 pieces and people running around and people with binoculars and cell phones. No, put that one over there. So jig never happened, even though we got the Art Gallery of Ontario to agree to use one of their most famous images by Rubens as the piece. It was just too expensive to rent that stadium. The Aurora nightclub was a grid of 10 by 10 pole dancer poles set up in a parking lot. and a call for anybody, men, women, children, pros, amateurs, to come and pole dance under, you know those highway lights that they use, right, to illuminate the highway? And we would invite 6 bands to play for 2 hours each. That had some engineering problems. There were a few more, including very large inflatable balloons, kind of like a solar system of images. But finally, I came up with the 8th Wonder, and this started its life with lots of drawings, like you saw with Amy's spacesuit designs. Hundreds of drawings kind of making this creature. And in the end, what I did is photographed all my friends' tattoos, and we made this kind of Victrola-headed, tentacled object, which was kind of really a symbol for a gathering place, and projected onto the bell of the Victrola horn. You could send messages, pictures from your phone in the audience. So another friend, Paul de Jong, a wonderful cellist who was in a fabled band for many years called The Books, an indie band. He and I played music for 12 hours. I think I made it for about 11, and he went the full 12 underneath. But the idea was to sort of create an icon for a place, to respond a little bit to the Baroque ceiling, and to make something unexpected. So I really believe in collaboration. I love this idea of a dialogue that you can have with other people over decades. And maybe we could go to the next one. This is a recent project called The Second Oldest Profession. These are cast glass fighter jets, bombers, and drones. A number of years ago, I'd made a big collage called Blanket, which was hexagonal arrangements of fighter jets from the Cold War era. And you know, from 30 feet away, it looks like beautiful snow falling, but then when you get up close, it transforms into this sort of deadly but beautiful image. And so the Museum of American Glass invited me to be in their first ever show of art by non-glass artists, right? So I think the glass community considers itself sometime in a bit of a ghetto, because you know, many of the artists in the glass world are really responding to the beauty. I was more interested in the toughness. We used aluminum foil, like from your kitchen, in the bottoms of these sand molds to kind of give that gritty, dirty kind of appearance of ice, you know, in the winter. A friend of mine coined a word for the snow that builds up behind your tires in the winter. In his SN section of his International Dictionary of Macrocosmic Neologisms, he has an N section for things like snaffle, the old stuff on the side of computer paper, or snard, which builds up behind your tires in the winter. And so I wanted kind of a snard-like appearance for the planes. But this is a great opportunity to work with a bunch of technicians to transform a picture into a big object that weighed about half a ton, and creates very beautiful shadows. And we're continuing to work on collaborations, including an upcoming one is, you know those viewers that you have at state parks that you put a quarter in, they look like a big African mask? Well, I've been working with that company for years on products and or on artworks, and we're going to do a visible one, like the Visible Man, so a completely clear viewer with only the mechanism for the coins and the binoculars as part of it. And the last image, I like to jokingly say that for 6 years I ran a space program. I was invited by the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art to do a project in solar power, and it was initially about how to design a layout for the panels that was an artwork. And I settled on a kind of giant code, like a Wheel of Fortune puzzle. So what you're looking at in that sort of gap-toothed piece is hundreds of solar panels and dozens of mirrors. So every solar panel represents a letter, every group of solar panels a word, and every mirror a space. So it's like a Wheel of Fortune puzzle. And so I searched for 6 months to find a quote, something that I didn't write, that would satisfy both the spirit of the project, which was becoming about space travel, and it had to work for a 51.6 kilovolt electrical load. So I had this limit of using a specific number of panels, because if I added one more panel, we'd have to have a whole new set of inverters, and the project would cost more. So there is a text hidden there, and after it was up for 8 years, somebody finally solved the puzzle. And I got an email from this guy who said he was a cryptanalyst at IBM, and his staff had brought this to him because they were stumped by it. This is the same staff who's been working on the Kryptos puzzle at the CIA. So they turned it over to this gentleman who will remain anonymous. And he struggled with it for a couple of weeks, but finally he wrote a code in sort of a fit over one weekend. And it searched the internet, and he solved the puzzle. We later met in person, and he gave me his card for his other company, which is called Rocket Science, which is pretty funny. But he has agreed not to reveal the code so that some other people can have a chance at figuring out what it says. But that was put up first, and then later I had this idea of a crash-landed spaceship that would sort of be in view of the code. So this is Codex Solus, this is The Shining, and they're all part of a project called All Utopias Fell. So that is a spaceship that you can go up into on a catwalk, and you can encounter the life of this missing aeronaut through his books and records, his scientific experiments. And I'm pleased to say it's very popular with children. So, and I've even found people kind of asleep in the chair, like watching videos, and they, when they wake up, I'm like, no, you're fine, just keep doing your thing. But that is a project that was up from 2010 to, it'll be up through next year, and I've just learned that they want to re-up the contract for another decade. So my work, I think, I've come up with a shorthand for it. My work is about the poetic interpretation of documents. And I get invited to work with a lot of museums and collections, and this has been one of my favorite projects.
Awesome, thank you. So I had mentioned that I had an interest in the combination between, or the interactions between science and art from a historic perspective. So you can think about naturalists going out into the field and having to actually sketch their own biological specimens or collecting them in almost artistic ways, which kind of, I think, references Francis's work almost with all of your painstakingly placed pins in the gallery. But so I wanted to pose a question to Jen, because I know your other work references quite a bit of medical history. So do you think about that historical interaction between art and science in your other work?
Yeah, the work I've spent for several years is mostly images of plants, but it's based on this historical idea that plants can inform us how to use them because they look like our bodies. So they have some kind of symbol or signature. Cloves look like your teeth. Ginger looks intestinal. You've been probably told to consume ginger or ginger ale, like when you have a stomach ache.
Is that real? Does that actually work or no?
At least in my head.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess that's all that's important.
There you go. But I'm interested, while these are outdated ideas about medicine, like what the potential cultural significance could continue to be with these old images or old historical scientific images. So there's a long tradition in history of printmaking and scientists who were also artists. In the 17th century, there were a lot of artists and scientists who were illustrating images about plants and science, or one example might be the Audubon birds in that collection. And there's a relationship with the form and the design of their compositions, as well as just illustrating what those birds are. So I think there's a strong tradition between art and science and history.
Thanks. So I kind of wanted to pose a question to everyone, and anybody can jump in if they feel the need. But Amy had talked a little bit about the difficulty in explaining research. Like sometimes it's difficult for engineers to describe every intricate detail of your work, right? Especially to somebody who doesn't necessarily understand everything that you're working on. What do you think the role then is of artists and in scientific research? I'm curious from everyone, but is it, creating interest in popular culture, or is it communicating ideas, asking critical questions, solving problems? Like, what is it about that interaction that you guys find most interesting?
Well, for my part, I just this last weekend saw the Apollo 11 movie out, Have you guys seen that yet?
Yeah.
It's really incredible.
Yeah.
Because they just took original footage and they didn't have a narrator or anything, and so they just put the story of Apollo 11 together through that original footage. And so you get that feel of the time and you get that excitement of the time. And I wasn't around for Apollo 11, but I felt like now I've been there for Apollo 11. And part of what they show you is they have these pretty simple schematics that NASA did use to try to communicate what was going on. Because people, this was the first time they'd been doing that. People didn't understand how this was going to work. And so they had very simple schematics and diagrams and images that they used to explain what was happening and what terminology were they using for each part of this mission. And I think that was so brilliant. You know, it's not complex art, but almost it's beautiful in the simplicity of how they did that and how much understanding that lent to people about what was going on. And so that's kind of still how I use it a lot today, is here's a complex thought, but this is what it looks like. And so you automatically get a better feel for what I'm trying to communicate to you. On the other hand, not historical or even explain what's happening now, in my field, when I've taken a history of space class, and one of the things that you see is that art is often used to explain things that we don't have yet. So here's my idea, right? I'm being creative and looking forward to what I want, and this is what it looks like. So if you think about the 1950s sci-fi books and their cover art, you could see things that you already recognize now, like, hey, you've got a watch that you can see pictures on and that you can communicate with, right? Egads. Guess what? And Star Trek, in the 1960s, transporters, tricorders. We're almost getting tricordery. I really want a transporter. Okay? But I could see it in the show. I could see how it would work. I could see what it did. And so it's almost like a future cast about things that, hey, why don't we work on that? Hey, that would be really cool. Hey, how does that happen? And so in a way, it almost guides what scientific endeavors are undertaken and what kinds of things can be realized in the future. In 1950, a cell phone was a crazy thought. That was just the computer power on the Apollo hardware, even on the space shuttle hardware, was nothing to what you carry around in your hand today. So those kinds of things, I think, are really where art does what it often does, which is inspire you to think about things in a new and different way, and then that leads to actually new and different things. So that's one of the things I think is really very powerful about using art and science together.
Yeah, I think that has a huge potential for artists as like futurists. And I know, Michael, you had talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think this has always been the job of the artist. Imagine a time when a few people had, seemingly special abilities to tell you stories from cultural narratives, to prove that these that these existed. Going to Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Italy and seeing 3 paintings by Caravaggio in a small chapel, 3 big paintings, 10 feet, 8 feet, showing the conversion of St. Paul, the martyrdom of St. Peter, and the calling of St. Matthew. Imagine being a pre-literate person and seeing this evidence, right, of something that you've heard about. I think that we know that's not really a power, right? That's a skill that you develop, right? And so when I think about people like Alexander von Humboldt, the great naturalist, who was also an artist, or I think about, as Jen mentioned, Audubon, the kind of mission of looking at the world, that involves a certain kind of vision, a sort of objective reporting. But I think that, this sort of greater vision, right, is that one that sort of anticipates. Neil Armstrong once said something like, science shows us what is, engineering shows us what could be, and I would go further and say that art shows us what we don't even know could be. But this is the kind of role, I think, of the arts within everything. We've been hearing a lot about John Maida's idea about turning STEM into STEAM. I think I have a more humorous version of that, which is meats or mates. Meat is something, if you like meat, it's delicious. And so like getting into the integration of the flavor and the texture and the experience, I think that there's a visceral side of learning, right? And there's also in mates a kind of collaborative side of learning, which I think is really important. And again, for me, I hold that emblem of, the romantic idea of the artist alone in the studio. But for some reason, at some point, we decide we need to put our stuff in front of a lot of other people, right? Because we want to communicate and because we want to participate in, a millennia's-old dialogue about making and about trying to understand how the universe works, and then to understand how we can shape it in positive ways and realize how we've shaped it in detrimental ways. Yep. Oh, and before I forget, can I just get a shot of everybody here? My archives. Okay. All right, could you guys on the side, come in? All right, maybe not. Okay, thank you.
Awesome.
Well, on Michael's point about storytelling, I think as humans, sitting around a fire, back in the old days with clubs and storytelling is one of those things that brings your friends along with you on a journey that you're taking through what you're telling them. And you all know, and I especially still like, books with pictures, right? So the story itself is of interest. If there's not a plot happening, it's not the pictures aren't as interesting. But if you have the pictures too, so much richer. So those things together tell that story. And one of the things that I wish I'd done here at Purdue was take the creative writing class. Because and marketing. Engineers are taught all about the equations and the theory and the practice and the nuts and bolts of building things. But what you don't realize is that storytelling part is what gets you people that support your idea, gets you funding that allows you to build your idea. And so it's that storytelling part that is key, really, no matter who you are. But I've seen it personally in the better storyteller I am at any given point, the more likely I am to be successful, because then I've got people that are coming along with me and want to see how my story ends. And that's one of the things that I've learned to embrace more as I've gone forward. I don't need to be this, I'm going to say cold, engineers aren't cold people, but very objective, methodical individual. This is all a human endeavor, and humans like stories. So that's one of the things I've taken away from, my engineering career has really kind of morphed into a storytelling career.
That's great. I mean, it's really interesting to think about the work that anyone might be doing now that won't even benefit them in their own lifetime. I met a number of years ago, Rebecca Armstrong, no relation to Neil, who's a British scientist and designer who's working on the Black Ship project, which is generational design. So right now, there's a consortium of people all around the world trying to design starships, and they're trying to design how you communicate the work on that to a future generation that might not be a speaker of language A or language B, that might not be working with technologies that exist now. And so that idea of sitting around and telling stories and inventing the future is really powerful. There was a science writer that I really liked from the 70s named James Burke, who was actually now that I think about it, the British equivalent of Walter Cronkite. He was narrating the moon landing for the BBC. And in the 80s or 70s, around the time that Sagan was doing Cosmos, James Burke came out with two great series, Connections and The Day the Universe Changed. Does anybody remember these? Yeah, and so he would start out, to your point, they would start out with a medieval storyteller. And then that would connect to some sort of idea about transcription, and that would lead into some idea about the Jacquard loom, and then weaving, and then finally you get to nuclear power, right? And that was the connections part of it. And so you realize how absolutely important the community of stories is in perpetuating this stuff that we're all involved with.
one of the things that I got to do last year was I took a communications class with Alan Alda. I forget the name of the institute, but you know Alan Alda from MASH, right? Hawkeye Pierce. So he realized, because he did some science shows too for a long time, and I'm sorry I don't remember the series he did, but what he found was, you know, if you go ask questions to an engineer, they start to be stiff and they start to use their jargon, and because that's their comfort zone, and it's really not very interesting or entertaining. But when you get them to talk, just tell me about your thing, right? Just talk to me about your work. And so when they didn't think they were being filmed, or they didn't think it was all going anywhere, they just had this nice conversation, and they were really very excited and interesting and interested about what they were doing, and that came across. Yeah. And so he has been working with actors helping engineers, which is not our comfort zone. So there's all these engineers sitting there, and we're like, and scientists, and they're like, come on, stand up. We're like, do I help you? But the exercises that they had us do really helped you understand how to tell your story in a much more engaging way. Right. And so it made you much more comfortable about, hey, what's your hobby? Hey, can I tell you about my thing that relates to your hobby so that you can understand what I'm talking about, and I can, you know, make sure that you are interested in what I'm talking about? And so some of those kinds of exercises really help that storytelling as well, because it's so important. And that's why these two creative endeavors really need to meet more and touch more.
Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, we're already out of time. So that went by so quickly. So we're actually going to have questions in the gallery space, since we had such a lively conversation on this side. So we will be continuing to take questions in the gallery directly after, and there is a reception, so usually that means free food. So hopefully we'll see you over there. Thank you all for attending, and thank you all panelists for coming and having such a great conversation. So we'll see you over there.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for being here. We will have a reception in Ringgold Gallery afterwards. Our panelists will be there, so feel free to come in, ask them one-on-one questions. And can we get another hand for Jana and our panelists? They did a fantastic job. Excellent.